some good replies to the last video and a lot of criticisms. The main criticisms were not enough pictures, not enough details and not enough charts. And I covered 2,000 miles in 10 minutes. So we're going to endeavour now to improve it and give you a lot more information. So let's try. This is the first part of South Australia, starting in Adelaide. I started here in the Adelaide River and worked my way out through the river, and here's the start point here. From then on, I went straight across to Edithburgh. First steam. Straight into Edithburgh here. Stayed the night. Now here's Edithburgh. It's a little anchorage in the middle here. It's shallow right in against the beach, and it blew its arse off all night south-east. It was really uncomfortable for the first night out. From then on I went through the channel here, out through the channel, inside Trowbridge Shoals, and then straight over to the next anchorage. Now bear in mind, I'd never been to these places before, so I went to Point Devonport and anchored there the night. I'm on my way to Port Lincoln, but these are the anchorages I anchored in here. I actually anchored right there at Port Devonport for the night. This line here is just a rough line, actually, basically where I went. Then I headed for Althorpe Island, because someone said Althorpe Island is a lovely place if the wind's good. So as it turned out, here's Althorpe Island here. As it turned out, it was an absolutely beautiful place, and I anchored just inside the reef here. Here's the wharf. I got my dinghy out, went on the wharf and went up on top of the lighthouse where I took my photographs. You'll see the photographs and you'll see the chart of Althorpe Island. It was a lovely anchorage, but in the night it went more southerly, quite hard, and the slop came around the corner and it got a bit rolly. So the next morning I departed, and I went up through Wedge Island. All these reefs here break, the whole lot of them, heavy break. Ems Reef's obviously the heaviest, but it breaks all the way through there, especially in heavy weather. When I went through it was all breaking, and I went up to Wedge. Now Wedge, I went straight through Wedge, but there's a lovely anchorage just here, just on this side of the reef, which I went to 3 years later. Then I went up to Whalers Bay. Now Whalers Bay. Now here's a lovely anchorage. I met a bloke in there called Graham Tapley, who lives on the island. He had a purse seiner in there. That's the first time I struck people that were being nice to me, because I anchored my boat outside this big steel purse seiner. Next minute this aluminium dinghy comes flying alongside me, and it was a guy called Graham Tapley. And the first words he said to me was, "That mooring in front of my boat is my one, you can have it." Didn't even ask who I was. So you had to come on board and had a couple of beers, and I stayed on the anchor as it turned out, and the next morning I headed up to Port Lincoln. Well, when I went to Port Lincoln, I went to visit my friends, and the guys that I worked with in the oil industry basically, there was Des Kenny, Steve Hunt and Todd Halliday. Now they're all big helps to me. Des took me all over Port Lincoln to get stuff fixed, and one morning I woke up in the harbour and my dinghy was ashore. It had come loose in the night, so Desi and his son came out in their dinghy and picked it up for me and brought it out to me. They were a tremendous help to me. Otherwise everything in Port Lincoln was right there where I wanted it, right on the foreshore. So it was, for me, the anchor, just a lovely anchorage. From Port Lincoln I went out through Boston Bay, out through the top of Boston Bay, and out to the Joseph Banks Group out here. Joseph Banks Group of Islands. They're about 25 miles northeast of Port Lincoln. So I went out to the St. Francis group and to Revesby Island, and fished, mainly for southern whiting. I caught one my second cast. That's how many were there. I went on to Revesby, and the first thing I discovered was big black snakes. Totally dangerous. You want big boots when you go on that island in case you stand on one. They're a bit slow because they're so fat, but they're absolutely dangerous. I stuck around Revesby for a week or so and then made tracks towards Coffin's Bay. So from this Joseph Beans group, I went down through Thorny Passage and across to the west coast. Now the first place I went into, on advice from cray fishermen, was Avoid Bay. And there's Avoid Bay actually, coming into Avoid Bay here, there was actually a few uncharted rocks. This one in particular here was quite dangerous. I actually come through the middle. I didn't actually come out here, I went right through the middle. And this rock here was just on the surface. Anyway, I anchored in there the night. It was bloody great really, because there's crayfishing boats around me. I loved it. And then from there on, I went up into Coffin's Bay. Now Coffin's Bay is a bit different. I stopped at Point Isaacs tonight and then made tracks into Coffin's Bay on the tide, because it's a really shallow entrance, as you can see. Here's the entrance to Coffin's Bay. Now I came down through the channel. Everyone said later on I should have come straight through here, but I didn't know that. All around Coffin's Bay, as you'll see in our photographs, we've got photographs to show you, is all this area here and down through here is oyster leases, famous for its oysters, Coffin's Bay. I've got photographs of Coffin's Bay to show you, and a better chart in fact. The only real drama I have at Coffin's Bay was leaving one day, and when I got outside the entrance, I looked down the engine room to check before I started heading up to Flinders Island, and there's water spraying all over my engine. I took the pump off and took it into Coffin's Bay to get welded and gave it to the local aluminium boat builder to weld. I thought, here goes, this is going to cost me a fortune. 2 days later, they come back down with the pump. And I said to the bloke, how much? How much is it going to cost me? He said, he said, a 6-pack will do. So it cost me 6 cartons of UDL cans, 6 cans of UDL of, I think it was Bundy rum. You won't get a cheaper job than that, I can tell you. Anyway, I got stuck in there for a while because I liked it so much, and so many people were coming down the boat, and I was talking to cray fishermen, and I started going to the yacht club for a few beers. I got a few photographs to show you. It was, I had to get out, and I headed up to Flinders Island. When you look at the first video, you'll see I mentioned Flinders Island and Homestead Cove. Now this is Flinders Island here, and this is Homestead Cove in here. This wee gap here. This is a big reef coming out here. You go in here and you anchor in here. Now, I anchored in here. You'll see from the photograph that we're going to show you that off this point, there's a wee white patch in the ocean. That's where I should have anchored. So when I anchored, I moved out to the white patch and anchored with Johnny Theakstone, and in the morning the breakers were breaking right across the front, but it was quite safe. This boat's 60 feet long, so it wasn't like I just pushed out through them. It was all white water. And then we moved around the front of Flinders Island and anchored there for the night. So you'll see from the photograph and the chart picture where Homestead Cove was. Relentlessly moved forward up to Scale Bay. Here's Scale Bay here for the night. Now this is the place to anchor in Scale Bay, but I anchored here. I anchored in the wrong place and it blew southeast 30 to 40 knots, and it was so shallow the boat was all over the place. In the end, it loosened my bowsprit. My anchor runs off my bowsprit. And then I moved up to Streaky Bay. Now you've seen pictures of Streaky Bay. We'll show you more. But here's basically the chart of Streaky. Coming down through here. It's very shallow. There's only you can't wander off the channel too far. And in Streaky Bay, I tied to the wharf. Best wharf I've ever been on, I reckon. And probably the fantastic hospitality from the people around there. I needed 2 stainless bolts made. And I was standing on the wharf whinging to some fisherman, some tourist, that I needed some bolts made. Anyway, it was probably 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked down to the end of the wharf, to the town end. And there's an old man there, older than me, crouched over, and he said, "Are you the bloke that wants those bolts made?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "This is my grandson's card. He owns Westside Engineering. He'll make them for you." That old bloke had been waiting down the wharf there for I don't know how long to give me that card. As it turned out, his grandson did make the bolts. And the shipwright called Mark Gulliver come down and refastened the bowsprit. I could have done it myself, but he'd done a better job, that's for sure. The people were so nice there. It was just country living in its best. Despite what people may think about these wee country towns, they were just the best. Just as a passing interest, I kept records of every day and proper records of everything I'd done every minute of the day. If I look through my logbook, everything's documented. Now if I go to, here's St. Francis Island here, when I started my engine, when I got to Port Sinclair, 2.3 metres of swell, steaming, what I'd done. So I left Streaky Bay here and went out to St. Francis, the St. Francis group up here. It calls the Isle of St. Francis. There's no one there. Fair dinkum. Here's Macillan Island here, where I met Richard Leach in here. Now this island here is a famous anchorage. All the tuna boats when the tuna boats used to fish around here, they all anchored in here. But completely protected from the south and the northeast and the north. Not so good and westerly, as you can see. So in St. Francis and Petrel Bay here, I anchored in there. I went across to the Franklin Islands. It's just a complete, there was no one there. If it's got to be the best, best sailing place, there's just no one there. I mean, I went into Smoky Bay here. Now, I didn't go up into Ceduna, which is up here, because I was there years ago. I didn't want to go back. And then I went across to, this is Port Sinclair in here. And then the other side of Port Sinclair is Cactus in here. Arguably one of the, it is one of the most famous surf breaks in the world. There's 4 great surf breaks in this area, from the point to here to right up to, they call it Castles over here. Met some surfers. A surfer said to me in start of June, the weather's good to cross the Bight. And that's what I stuck to. I look at the weather, left too early. The weather was really bad. It was so rough. I think for the first time in my life I was seasick. And that's when I lost the dinghy. I was tired, seasick, and it was just too rough to get that rubber ducky back. So I had to let it go. So I just let my rubber ducky go because it was just unsafe to attempt to get it back. That was the first day across the Bight. Probably only blew like 25 knots of southwest, but I was 150 miles offshore. and about 3.5 metres of swell, I think, if I looked at my logbooks. So, you know, what happened then was, it was so rough and I was so far offshore, I decided I'll head inshore. So I went inshore for a day, steamed in, and as I got further inshore, the wind got more behind me and eventually went northeast. And from then on, the next 3 days across the Bight, I had a lovely ride, except I was dead tired. That you don't require to fall into a deep sleep to get rest. And what he done was, he put a set of keys on his finger, sat in an armchair, and just as he started to go into a deep sleep, the keys hit the floor and he woke up again. So I done that for 4 days, going across the Great Australian Bight, so I could stay awake the whole way. My brain was just dead, like it felt dull, and I slept for 7 days on end. I slept 11 hours a day until I come right. Then I started to feel good again. I actually felt dull and sick until I had plenty of sleep. I've seen some really interesting things that weren't real. There right now, I've seen some really interesting things. I was hallucinating quite a bit. Better than the best drugs you've had. Strange things. Welcome back again. We're on our second leg now. We just went from Adelaide to Esperance, and it was about 1,000 nautical miles, and now today I'm going to go from Esperance up to the Abrolhos Islands and show you photographs as well as of different areas I anchored and explain different aspects of the journey. Explained in the previous video that I spent 7 days in Esperance and I was very tired from crossing the Great Australian Bight. So after 7 days I relentlessly headed towards West Australia, towards Perth, because that's where my home is and my family. So I looked at the weather forecast and left Esperance for about just under 24-hour journey to Albany in West Australia. The weather forecast wasn't bad. There was a weather window for 24 hours, and as I got to Albany, according to the weather forecast, the weather would deteriorate. Anyway, I left in quite a big swell, 3 or 4 metres, after a previous storm, and travelled to Albany in about up to 20 knots of southwest, and off Chain Bay, just east of Albany, 10 metres of swell. Now I'm thinking 10 metres of swell, if something goes wrong here I'm in big trouble. But regardless, I got into Albany, across the bay to Oyster Harbour. A lovely little wee anchorage that's got a little wee channel into it, into the harbour, where I slipped the boat, and because I had a leak, I slipped it at Emu Point shipyards, up for a day, down again. I had assistance from my friends. Mark Scriven was one who loaned me his ute. I used to work with him, and a lot of fishermen helped me a lot in Albany. Amazing really. And I met a cousin of mine called Nicola Edwards. But as relentlessly left again, I left Albany and went round Cape Lewin. Generally really bad weather, but I picked the weather window and it was easily travelling up to Cape Lewin, round Cape Lewin, up the west coast and round the corner into Eagle Bay, a famous tourist spot really. I've got some photographs of it here. And then across to Bunbury, where I spent several days, anchored inside the harbour on a nice little beach there. Lovely anchorage, absolutely lovely. I spent a couple of days there, then I steamed up to Mandurah and met a friend of mine up there, and Ivan Zorovich, and had a couple of beers up there and left Mandurah up to Woodman Point near Perth and anchored up there at Woodman Point. Over to Rottnest Island, spent 3 or 4 days there while I waited to get into Mindarie Keys, was where I live, really. After Mindarie Keys, I spent a month in Mindarie Keys. My wife decided she wanted to come with me, and a very brave act of hers actually to want to come with me, because I'm a bit of a loner, and when I go, I go. But she toughened up and came with me, and we headed up towards the Abrolhos Islands. So 24 hours from Perth. From Mindarie Keys to the Abrolhos Island is 24 hours. Now, Abrolhos Islands is one of the places I really wanted to go to because of its history, mainly because of its history, but it's a famous fishing place and a prolific cray fishing area. We arrived at the Abrolhos Islands. The first thing I thought was, there's a lot of reef around here, because everywhere you looked inside the islands, it was brown reef under the water, big brown patches with blue channels in it, and they were the channels you had to follow. So to the uninitiated, to me, quite frankly, it was a little bit scary. There was just reef everywhere, and the park's moorings, the government moorings, were inside all the reefs, so you had to find your way through. And the first place we stopped was Pelsard Island, right down inside Pelsard Island, through a maze of reef, and there was 5 absolutely beautiful moorings in there. We tied up absolutely pristine area, and absolutely excellent moorings in fact. So the Abrolhos Islands is famous for cray fishing, and it's also famous for the wreck of the Batavia, East Dutch Indian Company vessel that sunk or run aground on Morning Reef in the Wallaby Group in the Abrolhos Islands in 1629. Now, quite a few vessels come to grief on the west coast of Australia, because in those days they could calculate their longitude reasonably well, their latitude, sorry, reasonably well, but their longitude, a lot of their longitude was dead reckoning, because they didn't have clocks. Basically, that's a basic reason. So quite a few boats left the Cape of Good Hope and sailed across the Indian Ocean. If they misjudged it, they hit Australia, and that's what happened to the Batavia. Now, in itself, it may have just been a wreck, but afterwards, the murder, the rape, and the absolute savagery by the survivors was taken into folklore. I think there was 321 people on board the Batavia went run aground, 40 drowned during the wreck. Of the 261 survivors, 125 were murdered over the next 4 or 5 months. If you need to know more of this type of history, you can go to The Batavia, written by Peter Fitzsimons, which I recently read. It's just an absolute act of savagery. So, if you're interested in that, well, that's the history of the Abrolhos Islands. Amazing place, fantastic fishing, great history, and a prolific cray fishing place. Welcome back to the next episode. We've just been to the Abrolhos Islands in the last episode, and now we're moving on. And this time I intend to cover from the Abrolhos Islands to Broome. Abrolhos Islands are about 30 miles offshore, about 30 to 40 miles off Geraldton. And after a week or so there, we decided to move over to Port Gregory. I'd never been there before. It's been an famous place over the years. It's a massive recreational fishing spot, a lovely thin anchorage inside a reef. Now, I'd never been there, so we went in there. It was only a narrow anchorage, lovely until if there's any big swell, at high tide the swell comes over the reef and tends to rock the boat terrifically, and it's subject to a lot of current as the tide runs either way through a gap in the reef on the south end. But anyway, we stayed there 2 days and decided to move to Kalbarri. Now, because I've got a friend in Kalbarri called Mitch Burgess. I used to work with him, and so we moved to Kalbarri. Now Kalbarri is on the Murchison River, and it's an unusual river mouth where the actual river runs at right angles. The river mouth runs at right angles to the beach, and it's protected by a reef on the outside, as you'll see from the photographs. Now, to the uninitiated there as well, it's like a washing machine, because the waves hit the reef in a big swell and continue on across the river mouth. So depending on what you're thinking at the time, or whether you've got experience, it could be a frightening experience. Anyway, I rang Mitch, and Mitch organised John Chalk, a local fisherman, and he explained to me how to get in, which I just took on board. I took local knowledge and went straight in. It was quite a big swell and very sloppy, and quite frankly my wife was terrified. Inside the river, dead flat, in this lovely coastal town called Kalbarri. Absolutely beautiful it is. A beautiful town, a lovely anchorage. We anchored about 100 miles away from the wharf. And some interesting points about Kalbarri. While I was there getting fuel, I got 500 litres of fuel in Kalbarri, a bloke came along the wharf and said, "Is that the Adriatic out there?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I used to own that 30 years ago." And his name was Greg, or Bangles, McDonald. Now to me, meeting a previous owner was an absolute highlight. And he was fascinated. He came on board and seen all the changes that had been made from when it was a fishing boat. And he used to fish the North Island of the Abrolhos crayfishing there. It was a great time for me just meeting him. And after about 10 days of just loving Kalbarri, and Mitch came over with his children, and it was just lovely to meet them, I decided to move to Shark Bay, which meant, of course, firstly, leaving the river mouth, which my wife was very apprehensive, I can tell you. So I left Kalbarri for Shark Bay, which was only about 15 hours away, I believe. I can't remember, something like that. With the southwest 25 knots behind me. But the problem is in Kalbarri, or heading that way, is the Zundorf Cliffs. The swell bounces off the Zundorf Cliffs and turns that track up to Shark Bay into a washing machine, and it was rough. We were surfing down one wave and punching into the next, coming off the cliffs. Eventually we got to Shark Bay and it was dead flat. Shark Bay is an absolute wilderness. A wilderness for boat. There's just a massive area where there's virtually no one, hardly see a boat, and anchorages everywhere. So we went into Shark Bay, went into the town of Denham, Monkey Mire, fished, went into a lot of bays and fished. It was absolutely beautiful. It's a wilderness. And we had a fantastic time in Shark Bay, you'll see from the photographs. A couple of days in Monkey Mire, went out for dinner there. And relentlessly moved north towards Carnarvon. Now, Carnarvon's just a little port. We tied up to the wharf there. Spent a couple of days, got food. And we'd been there before, so we decided to move to Coral Bay, quite a famous tourist spot, and it's the start of the Ningaloo Reef. Ningaloo Reef goes for about 500 miles up to North Cape, right along the coast. Coming around Quobba Point, just north of Carnarvon, was quite rough, good forecast, quite rolly, and for the first time in my life, my wife got seasick. She worked in all sorts of boats with me before, but she got seasick, and she came out of the bedroom and told me, gave me a bit of a speech about my pedigree, and she went back to bed. I turned the boat round, when she's in bed, went back to Carnarvon. When she woke up in the morning, we were tied to the wharf, and she said, "What are we doing back in Carnarvon?" I said, "You're getting off and you're getting on a plane." She looked at me, and I booked a plane ticket for her home. So it's probably the best thing for both of us, really. And I headed back up to Coral Bay and anchored up there. It was blowing so hard at Maud's Landing, it was blowing 30 or 40 knots of southwest. It was screaming. And I'm thinking, I'm glad she's not here, because it was just white water. Now I left Maud's Landing, which is right next to Coral Bay. I went to Norwegian Bay, went inside the reef. It was blowing 30 or 40 knots, dead flat, but just cold and windy and white water everywhere. Then I left Norwegian Bay and went to Tanabiddy. Tanabiddy's another gap in the reef near North Cape. When I was there, there was 13 dive boats there picking up tourists, and every day those dive boats were full of people diving with whale sharks or just diving on the reef. And I picked up a public mooring there, and it blew every day. After 2 days I moved away, went round Northwest Cape to Soraya Island, then down to Onslow, and then out to the Montebello Islands. The Montebello Islands is famous for the atomic bomb tests in the 50s. I believe the British conducted 4 atomic bomb tests on the Montebello Islands, but it's in the most beautiful places, anchorages, completely safe anchorages everywhere. It's not that well charted, but you can see the bottom. So I spent 2 weeks there fishing. It was just heaven, you know. Man, fantastic. As I relentlessly moved on, I went to Dampier, to the Dampier Archipelago, where I used to work for 10 years. Fished all the way along there. The fishing was absolutely fantastic, unbelievable fishing. Coral trout, red emperor, red-throated emperor. Well, the list just goes on. You could just fish all day. There's only one person, so how many fish do you need? Stopped at Westmore Island. I went to Port Hedland, where I had friends. Now Port Hedland is very inhospitable for yachties. They don't want you in the harbour because it's the... Port Hedland's, I think, it's got the second, if not the highest, freight in weight in the world coming out of there. And it's all big iron ore ships, massive tugs, just not interested in yachties. You can't even take your dinghy into the harbour without security clearance. Although meeting my friends was fantastic for me, I had a really good time and fantastic hospitality from them, from Ian Gear and his wife, Trude. The place itself was very inhospitable. And they had a fantastic yacht club with no yachts. The yacht club was the centrepiece of the town, and 600 meals in the weekend. Just a fantastic, really a fantastic place, except they didn't want yachties. So I moved from Port Hedland because I had a friend in Broome, and so I went to Broome and anchored there for 2 weeks. Done a bit of work to the boat. New batteries, refurbished my starter motor. Basically had a good time with my friend Seth Wright and his wife, and my wife came up. We had a really good time in Broome, except the anchorage at Gauthier Bay off 90 Mile Beach, just subject to roll and tide constantly. So that was my journey from the Abrolhos Islands to Broome. That's the end of that segment, and I'll go on to the next one. Thanks for watching. That's the end of the video. I've tried to do it really quickly because it didn't have a lot of time, but if you need to have a look or good look at it, just subscribe and you'll be able to see it all. And it's just a rough guide and all my photographs of what I've taken and other people's photographs of where I've been. An interesting journey about how great Australia really is. So thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.